Welcome to this little mini tutorial on reading safety data sheets, the most interesting thing we can do in safety. I've picked this to discuss because it's something that many of us completely miss, mostly because safety data sheets seem very hard to read and can be quite overwhelming when you look at them and see the amount of technical information that's given in them. But they are really critical. And it's probably one of the most overlooked things when we have safety data sheets in the workplace, often they're just stuck in a folder. And as if someday, if something goes wrong, we can magically open them up and have all our questions answered. Not always the case. They're actually quite easy to read. There's not that much in it that is important to you every day. So we can go through it and see what's important, relevant, and how to get the best out of them. Legislative requirement to have a safety data sheet for every chemical considered hazardous, which is really based on whether it can cause you injury. And picking WD-40 today, just because it's a chemical or a substance that most of us are familiar with, that we typically have in the home in some form and often in the workplace. And it's one of those ones that goes under the radar, particularly for that reason, because there's that little part of the legislation that talks about household use or household purpose, household quantity that we hear. And what that usually means is people forget that we need to look at this stuff and do some safety things around it. It's usually seen as a get out of jail free card. If it's a household quantity, you don't need to do things with it. You don't need to risk assess it. You don't need any particular safety data sheets even. That's not quite strictly true because the concept of household use is that something is incidental to your workplace, that it's something that you don't normally use as part of your day-to-day work operations. And so things like WD-40, of course, aren't typically a day-to-day work thing. You usually would use them if there's a squeaky chair or if something needs lubrication of some form. And it's typically something you find in your garage at home rather than in the workplace. But it's there, and oftentimes it can cause injury because it's a complicated and potentially dangerous substance. So it's a good one because we all hopefully have an awareness of it and what it is, what it looks like. And I'll take you through the safety data sheet so you can get a feel for what is included in a safety data sheet. And then once you're familiar with the pattern and the format, you can read any of them. What we need to do is to look at the safety data sheets for pretty much every chemical we have in the workplace, and see what it requires of us. What do we do if something goes wrong? What could go wrong? Is our first aid up to scratch? Is our fire safety up to scratch? How do we store this thing and how do we use it safely? It's as simple as that. And we can do a lot better, I feel, by understanding how these things work. So what you'll see is a lot of typical standard formatting requirements. There's always the requirement to have an address of the manufacturer or the importer and emergency telephone contact details. So here you've got the number to call in case something goes wrong. The product name is there. The product use, purposeful use is there. You can't use it for things outside that. Otherwise, this safety data sheet won't apply. That's important. Typically, you won't go beyond what it's required to. You hope not. The STS applies to these unit codes, which line up with the products that you can see. And it's important when you look at a safety data sheet to make sure it is relevant for your specific chemical that you have, because there are a lot of different varieties. And there's no standardized, 100% standardized approach to this. There are companies who provide up-to-date safety data sheets for the products they sell, particularly companies, groups, safety things, all offer services like that. But there's still a lot of variations. And if you import something or manufacture something, you can do a safety data sheet as long as it fits the right format and has the right information. So there can be a bit of variation. Always important to check. The date is a critical thing you need to look at. They have to be within 5 years, and manufacturers will always update them, typically right at the 5 year point. But this one's got another few months left in it. But it's something to keep an eye on. And regulators love picking you up on an out of date safety data sheet because it's an easy win for them. So that's all the stuff that sits there and has to sit there. Now, when we go down the list or down the page, we see categorization of the materials, aerosol category 1, and label descriptors. These are to show you how it's classified. Really important when you're storing a lot of stuff. Because if you're familiar with the WHS regulations, there is a requirement to look at quantities. If you exceed a certain quantity, you have to have a manifest. If you go beyond the manifest quantities, you have to have special permission, basically, from the regulator to store certain amounts of chemicals. You're never going to get that, I don't imagine, with WD-40 unless you were a large hardware store and you're stockpiling a lot of this stuff for sale. Then you do have potentials of a lot of this material in one spot. So it's important to know which category you're in for that reason, for how much you're allowed to store. And some things are quite small. Some very toxic chemicals will sit at around 5 kilos as a point before you have to put a manifest together. And the manifest is really just a list you can hand to the fire department and say, everything's on fire, here's what we've got, be careful. But of course, you go beyond that manifest quantity and you have to seek permission or inform the regulator typically to say we've got this on site. And the emergency services as well. You have to have emergency plans to suit it. There's a lot of things in there. So we're not talking at that level. We're just talking pretty much small quantities still require the safety data sheet. So the labels there gives you some key warning points. For WD-40, it's flammable, it's pressurized, so it could burst, and you can't swallow it. They're the real core dangers, and that's there, it's clear. There's no way of mistaking that. And everything else in the safety data sheet really points back to these main points. Preventions are there, that's really critical. So keep away from heat, hot surfaces, sparks, open flames, and other ignition sources. No smoking. So I'd want to see if I walk into your workshop where you've got WD-40, that you haven't got it sitting in the sun, that it's not sitting near an oven or near some form of hot work like welding equipment. It's not near sparks, flames, barbecues, and there's a no smoking policy. So they're the sort of things that you should be checking and you should be building into your planned inspections if you have chemicals in the workplace. And most of these are standard for pretty much every chemical you're going to encounter. Similar ones will apply for fuels and other lubricants too. So good to see, good to point out, good to make sure you're covered. Do not pierce or burn even after use. People love uh, doing weird things to cans after you finish with them, so throw them away appropriately. Uh, Critical one, of course, if it's swallowed, is the main problem, and they mention that quite clearly here. Call the poison center, numbers up the top, or your doctor. Do not induce vomiting. Typically, should be obvious, but it's going to burn on the way up just as much as it burns on the way down. So you need to deal with it quickly and not cause further harm. And it's just repeating things here. Then you've got the ingredients in it, which really doesn't matter for our purposes. It does, again, large quantities and particularly storage, but the storage requirements are clear and outlined below. So this is more for the bulk management of this material. Can be important if your workplace mixes and does all sorts of other things with chemicals, but typically won't be an issue. Now, first aid is given some detail around it, and this is what you need to look at for every safety data sheet, because what you need to be asking yourself as you go through these is if something went wrong, do we have the first aid facilities on site to deal with this? So if it's swallowed, it's an aspiration hazard. So what's that? Breathing can cause a lot of problems. Do not induce vomiting. Contact medical people, call the Poisons Information Centre. They'll probably say go to the hospital straight away. Eye contact, flush thoroughly with water, remove contact lenses, and continue flushing. So do you have facilities to flush eyes after contact with your eyes? Using a can of WD-40, it's quite likely to spray it in your face if you're not careful. It can bounce off something. It can misfire if something's blocked in the spray thing, if you're using one of those little tubes to get a pinpoint spray. There's all sorts of ways things can go wrong, which is why a bit later it does say wear goggles. But you need to make sure in your workplace there's enough of a facility around to wash your eyes out. It's not enough to be able to have a sink that you can put one part of your face in for a bit, then the other part in. You need either an eye wash station so that you can flush your eyes continuously, see, for several minutes, or first aid eye wash bottles. But then again, how long will they last? So it's good to make sure you've got a water supply and that you can get your head under that water supply. So that's something really critical. This will apply to all chemicals that you'll encounter. How do you make sure your first aid is up to scratch? Because you don't want to have that conversation with someone after they've lost their eyesight because you didn't think through the first aid implications that are really clearly laid out here. This is your legal contract, if you like, to make sure you do it right. And it's not hard as long as you prepare, because you can get enough of those eye wash bottles and you can adapt sinks quite easily, especially when you need to upgrade them. Make sure that they're fitting the purpose of your workplace needs. Skin contact, soap and water, pretty simple. It's not going to hurt you unless you're there spraying it all day on your arm. It's not going to do too much drama. It'd be off to the doctor for a check if there was irritation, because it's probably more of an allergy than anything else. Breathing in can irritate, so move to fresh air and then get medical attention if symptoms persist or develop. So again, that comes in a bit later, but there's no ridiculously scary things around this. Ventilation is critical, but that's another side to it. Most important symptoms it mentions, prolonged contact can cause skin drying. Long-term inhalation can cause central nervous system depression, which is really critical. And this is a common thing in workshops, workplaces that aren't well ventilated, and ingestion can cause significant health issues. So, yeah, breathing in, swallowing, too much exposure can cause problems. Not many chemicals wouldn't have that level of concern. So what do you do with the first aid of that? Just keep an eye on it, really. There's nothing you need to do. It's more just monitor, and that's it. Um, Critical one is ingestion, though. If you're swallowing it, getting it into your system in some form, it's off to the doctor. That is pretty clear. So there it is, and that's all it takes. If you can quickly look at each SDS and pick that stuff through and work out what first aid do I need? Do I need an eye flushing kit? Do I need special burn bandages? It'll tell you. So make sure they're there. It's a great way to do a bit of a first aid assessment of your workplace too. Firefighting measures are next. It doesn't specify the exact only requirement of firefighting, but it does tell you which extinguishers to use and have. So that would be a quick, simple check that your fire extinguishers are right and they're in the workplace and they're there. Great. Do not use water jet or flooding amounts of water, because it's obviously an oil-based lubricant and won't work so well. It'll float and spread the fire. So that's an important one to mention. When you do emergency drills, if you have WD-40 in your workshop or your workplace, make that an emergency drill so everyone's on the same page. What happens if this catches fire? We don't throw the hose on it. Why? Because it'll cause worse fires. We do this, we do that, and get people trained up in it and experience it. Or maybe not experience it, but experience the process of it. Now, hazards arising from the chemical, that's really important, because oftentimes chemicals aren't that bad, but they catch fire and significant issues will arise, particular exposure to chemicals. It is an extremely flammable aerosol and it's under pressure. So their concern in this is that it could explode if you heat it up too much. That's why it says don't keep it near heat sources and things like that. And that's pretty typical with any aerosol. Nothing over the top scary. Just look after it and be careful. Otherwise, it could explode. And don't be an idiot and spray it onto flame for fun. It might seem obvious, but people do silly things. Firefighters should wear positive pressure self-contained breathing apparatus and full protective clothing. So this is why it's so critical. If you had a lot of this in your site, enough to go over the manifest quantity, firefighters need to know what's there, because they can be exposed to very difficult situations if they don't know what the chemical is that they're fighting. So that's why the manifest is so critical. 1 can of it, not worried about. 100 cans could be a problem. So they need to know what's there, putting signs up, having your SDS register, being aware of what's on your site, really critical. Talks about accidental release measures, not as critical for what we're talking about here. This is a real problem if we're talking ammonia tanks or things like that. But it is important to note if you store it in a particular area, it has a risk of catching fire. So having heat and ignition sources is a concern. Make sure the area is well ventilated and always wear protective clothing. So yeah, it seems obvious, but it's there. And there's a cleanup requirement, what to do if you get a leaking can. Uh, Put it in a plastic bag until the pressure is dissipated. Common sense, but it's important because if it accidentally gets bumped and dropped and it starts hissing and fizzing and carrying on, you've got to be careful with it and handle it appropriately. Handling and storage, these are the critical ones because you will often have a variety of chemicals in your workplace, some of which you can't store together. And if you have an auditor or a regulator come through and see that you're storing the wrong ones in the wrong ways, you can get into serious trouble, including fines and all sorts of things. So here it says pretty much repeating, don't keep it near flames, don't keep it near electrical cools or things like that. WD-40 cans have always been a bit of a mystery to me. I remember they do set off your the car triggers in underground car parks and things because they have quite a significant property to them. So yeah, you've got to make sure you store them carefully because they're potentially volatile things, and away from children is a critical one too. That's important if you've got a workplace where children do come in and out. If there's cleaning cupboards or workshop cupboards that children could access, then be very, very careful with that. Again, store in a cool, dry, ventilated place. So it's not giving you any secrets. It's telling you everything over and over to really reinforce the critical points. You really have to go far to mistake the points it's trying to make here. Don't swallow it. Try not to breathe it in, and don't set fire to it or get it too hot. Now, the next section isn't as critical for this product, but it can be for others because some product exposures have a limit point and you need health monitoring and very careful controls of how you expose workers to these things. So if you see none established and it's, yeah, you can not be sure that it's safe, but there's nothing you have to immediately worry about in that sense. Normal consumer use, it talks about, which is what most workplaces would use WD-40 for, unless you were maybe a bike repair shop and WD-40 was your choice of chain lubricant, and every single chain you were doing thousands of chains a week were all WD-40. That's always the case, but I have seen that. That would probably be into the more bulk use. But normal consumer use, so this is the standard use, well ventilated area. So don't use inside a closed office room. I remember setting off WD-40 at home once when I was young, fixing a squeaky chair. My grandmother's rocking chair, it was one of those recliners, and it stung the place out for a long time. I had no idea how bad it would be, but it certainly led to headaches because it's bad in a confined area. Most workplaces, workshops will be well ventilated, but it's something to consider quite carefully. Now, PPE, avoid eye contact, obviously. Always spray product away from your face. Might seem sensible, but how often have we accidentally made a mistake? Quickly grab it, press it, bang. Easy to do. Skin protection, avoid prolonged or repeated skin contact. Again, wear gloves if you're going to use it and come into contact with it. I'm sure I saw somewhere wear eye protection. It says avoid eye contact and always spray away from your face. It's not actually saying wearing to wear eye protection, but yeah, it wouldn't hurt. Bulk processing, slightly different story because it is telling you to wear safety goggles. So in the workplace, if WD-40 is part of your normal work routine, I would suggest having safety goggles there, and that's something you can build into your PPE requirements. And what I would suggest whenever you get a chemical is to do a little assessment on it, Is our first aid right? Is our emergency right? What PPE do we need to have? What do we need to do to train everyone to make sure they know what to do with it? Have that, use that, sign people off, and you're done. But yes, it tells you, and it will always tell you, household, home-based use, pretty straightforward, but be careful. Workplace, take extra precautions to do the right thing. But still, it's not over the top with this. None required if ventilation is adequate in terms of a respirator. But if you do exceed exposure limits, and that's typically measured over like an intense 15-minute period or generally over the whole day, you got to wear a respirator. So I would be very careful with all your chemical use to make sure that you're checking how much people do actually use things. If you're getting headaches, if people are mentioning concerns like that, then you got to do something about it. But most of the time, it's pretty straightforward. Washing hands, no other PPE required, good hygiene. I love that. Aerosol spray with a pleasant scent. That's up to opinion. I think it's quite pleasant, but it can get over the top. Talks through all the flash points and the boiling points. Really critical if you have other chemicals that you're mixing, merging, doing things with. Here, it's just of interest, really, but it's important to know what these sections mean. Stability and reactivity, critical ones. If you have chemicals that decompose in some form and then mix, and then you're stuck in a workplace and these things have mixed, that's where you can get killed. That's very serious in a lot of cases. So this is where you really need to look and go, what do I need to make sure I'm not storing this thing next to? And so incompatible materials, strong oxidizers and strong acids. So you're going to want to make sure that when you're storing things, that you're checking and making sure you put the right things in the right spots. And that might mean popping your WD-40 in your hazardous chemical cupboard with other things that can stay cool and stay safe. If it goes wrong, they won't explode and do other things to each other. Simple as that. And that's not something I'll ever sit here and advise you to do as a whole. You're going to have to do that for each chemical you've got. And once you've done it, it's done. And you can just check it as you go. And it's not hard. It's not like this is new every time. These are standard things, standard ways of doing stuff. And yeah, you get it right, you're fine. Again, toxicological information, a little bit more detail in what it can do. So before it talked about skin irritation, now it's just getting into the more detail and saying it could be fat with possible dermatitis. It can dry your skin out and lead to irritation. Not too much to worry about unless you've been exposed and you need to try and understand, medical practitioners trying to understand why this is causing concerns. It is quite repeated, but can be very critical when you're talking about far more insidious chemicals, the ones that we really try and avoid at all costs that can even affect our DNA structure and things like that. They are out there, and thankfully not something you can usually pick up at Bunnings. But we must make sure we're aware of these points and why these safety data sheets are so critical. No concerns for chronic exposure, but it can aggravate pre-existing conditions. So that's important too. This can be very critical, not so much in what we're talking about today, but for roles that involve constant chemical exposure, we do need to assess whether that's going to trigger off people's underlying conditions. If you're exposed to a lot of dust and you've got underlying emphysema or something like that, there can be a huge risk of further aggravation, damage, and your body not being able to repel the chemical or the issue as much as you'd like it to. So we do need to be aware of that and realize that some people need to be quite safe by not being exposed to this stuff. And that's important. Toxicity values. Um, yeah, again, it's a medical measurement and looks like animal testing in that sense, which is always a little scary, but we need to understand what it can do to us. Again, more scary things can be uh, understood, identified, and then dealt with by the detail in here. Nothing listed as a carcinogen that's critical. If it was, you'd probably find um, definitely more controls around the product, but also probably a requirement to wear full clothing and gloves, even in household use. And there we go. Ecological information, talking about potentially what it has in terms of our environmental impact. If you have ISO accreditation for environment, you need to be picking up on this stuff and working out where you're using this, how you're using it, how you're disposing of it. You don't want to kill the fish population of your local river because you chucked a few tins in the back of the building and down into the gully. Uh, Handling and disposal comes into again. Yeah, there will be things stated if there are specific concerns, and you must pick up on this. So if you want to comply with your environmental requirements, and I say ISO, but there are legal requirements around environmental management too, you must look at this and have some basic awareness of how to dispose of things. And there's some transport information too, different standards of safety management around transport of chemicals. And that's something outside of here, but it's important that we look at that. Like aerosols shouldn't be transported by air, is mentioned here. Critical if you're an importer or you're using chemicals, buying and selling, but not for the purposes of what we're looking at. And there's some more information that goes through there of how it fits into everything and some guidance for the reading of the data sheet needs to be signed off. And there it is. So to summarize, every chemical has a safety data sheet if there is any form of hazardous potential to the chemical. We have a legal obligation to have safety data sheets readily available in the workplace for those who use them. Typically, we make the mistake of just printing them out, shoving them in a folder, and then they're there and they tick the box. But there is really critical information in these that we need to pull out and deal with, mostly around first aid, emergency planning, and safe use, really, and safe storage. They're the four things. So they're easy to read because they just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. You can't go wrong, and it's there for you. So take every chemical you've got, look at the safety data sheet, check it against your first aid and emergency planning, check it against your training and your induction, and make sure you can tick the box that everything lines up and your workers know how to use it. That can be problematic if you've got 200 chemicals in your workplace, but what you'll find is that there are a lot of crossovers and you won't have to get a whole new first aid pack for every different chemical. Typically, you will have everything the same except for a few outliers. The critical thing is that you've got to do this because guaranteed someone will get hurt using the one chemical you haven't checked the safety data sheet for. The regulator's going to walk in and say, did you risk assess the use of this chemical? Then you'll say, we've got a safety data sheet. And I'll say, yes, but did you risk assess? Did you look at the safety data sheet? Did you check that it was that you're complying with all the requirements listed in it? And you'll go, did you train the worker in using the safety data sheet? And you'll go, and that's when fines and prosecutions can be very easy for the regulators. So that's the legal side. For a practical side, this stuff will protect workers because it shows you what are the concerns. If I spray a WD-40 on my arm, I just run inside and wash it off. If I spray it in my eyes, I flush them out and I seek medical attention if it hasn't quickly and easily resolved. If I breathe it in, I probably seek medical attention because it could do some damage to my lungs. If I ingest it, so if I've sprayed it and it's, sprayed it into the lid and for some unknown reason I've swallowed a big chunk of it, you're going to send me off to the hospital because there's probably a lot of damage that's going to get done from it. Now, knowing that is really important. It's a bit like snake bites. You don't want to wait until you've been bitten by a snake to read the St. John's manual to work out whether you compression bandage it or whether you walk around and run around, whether you try and suck the venom out or whether you do something else, This is the critical point where we can plan, understand, and then nothing will go wrong because we're all ready. I hope that's useful. Every safety data sheet will follow the same or similar format. And if you ever have any concerns with how you can apply and risk assess these chemicals and interpret these safety data sheets, we're always here to help. Thank you.